Bonjour. 2 weeks ago, I had the absolute privilege of cycling 550 kilometers across your beautiful country with 160 supporters, fundraisers of my charitable association, Help for Heroes. And cycling for many different reasons, because they wanted to support wounded and injured soldiers in their rehabilitation and recovery. I also had the privilege of cycling with 17 wounded soldiers, again, there for very, very personal reasons as part of their own recovery. I cycled with Steve. Steve was a Royal Engineer in the Army prior to Afghanistan and Iraq. Steve had many demons in his mind. As a boy, he joined the army because he wanted to get away from a brutal father. And during his successful army career, it came to a more abrupt end because when Steve was in Northern Ireland, one of his jobs was to clear away some of the debris from the bombings. And one day, part of that debris was a baby's hand. That will live with Steve for the rest of his life. And cycling is one of the ways that helps him to recover and live his life to the full. It helps him have a purpose and a focus. I also cycled with Johnny. Johnny had a back injury, a serious back injury. And it was so bad, he was told he could not do sport again. But he fought against that, and he cycled in what we call a recumbent bike, lying down, which is quite difficult, as you can imagine, when you're going uphill. And Johnny used cycling in a recumbent bike as part of his own recovery. And I also cycled with another wounded soldier, again a Royal Engineer, who was shot 6 times in the stomach in Afghanistan. And he now has a really successful career. But his job, cycling, was to help all of those other wounded soldiers feel good because he had done it once before. He was a really good role model. And it was really fitting that we ended the ride, the cycling. We started in Sainte-Mère-Église and we ended in Paris. And we received our medals at Les Invalides, which was a fitting place for our soldiers to be, where you look after your wounded soldiers very well. And when I was cycling through your beautiful countryside, through the beautiful fields of wildflowers, I saw poppies, the red, beautiful wildflowers that we in the United Kingdom use to remember those who were injured and killed in previous conflicts. The history of military charity associations in the UK started through a very simple gesture of giving money, as you do for the Bleuet, giving money for a red poppy. And by coincidence, that poppy was introduced into the UK by a French lady, Madame Guérin. So we very much are grateful to you for the history of our military charities. And in the UK, we had a health service which wasn't introduced, a welfare service that the government paid for until the end of the Second World War. And many military charitable organizations pick up some of the responsibilities of helping the wounded, injured, and sick, and their families to live better, independent lives. But when Afghanistan and Iraq happened, the British government, and indeed some of our charitable organizations, were not prepared for the vast scale of what was happening to our soldiers. So from a UK perspective, we had 2,000 brave men wounded in action. We had 616 seriously injured and very seriously injured. 265 amputees with 416 amputations, so some with many amputations. But those brave men were positive about their own rehabilitation and recovery. And because the British public were overwhelmed by what they saw, and because the founders of my charitable organisation wanted to do something about it, the public gave in their tens of thousands of pounds to support those wounded soldiers, initially just to get a swimming pool, because these men wanted to be fit. But the support grew and grew and grew. And now my charitable organisation helps thousands of men and women and families who may have been medically discharged a year. And the kind of people that we help with their rehabilitation and their recovery are people like Scott. Scott was a paratroop in the paratroop regiment. He was 20 when he was injured. And he was blown up by an IED in Afghanistan. He lost both of his legs. And his dream was to be able to walk again. But that wasn't enough. He then wanted to run again. And that wasn't enough. And then he wanted to compete. So he took part in the Warrior Games with the United States. He then took part in the Invictus Games. He then became a Paralympian. He is now a para-Nordic skier and took part in the Pyeongchang Games. He said, if you're going to do anything, and this is a very British phrase, throw the kitchen sink at it, put everything at it. And that's exactly what he did. And I'll mention a Royal Marine Commando, Toby, who was shot in the neck and paralysed from the waist down. Toby doesn't know if he's going to wake up in the morning sometimes because of the ventilator that he's on, and he worries about that. But it doesn't stop him. He went to university, he studied business, and he now runs his own business in extreme sports clothing. A brave man indeed. He's pushing the boundaries. And we also help other men and women to push those boundaries. I even have a gentleman called Sai, who was shot through the eye, and he was a Royal Engineer too, and he is now working for a charitable organisation because he wants to give back. And that's something quite particular about the brave veterans that Help for Heroes supports through the charitable organisation. They really want to give back, so they don't just want to do something for themselves. They overcome their pain, their suffering, and they want to do things for other people. So many of our young men and women have become role models for young people, people who maybe have lost their way themselves, had their own personal challenges at home. Some of them have given their bodies to research and are taking part in research about scarring and wounds. They're taking part in long-term studies because these were unexpected survivors. These are young men that would never have lived but for the wonderful medicine and support that was available from clinicians and some of the equipment and kit. So when they were on the battlefield and injured, they could tourniquet themselves, they could look after themselves and get quickly casualty evacuated back to the UK. And they are all now helping those young men and women who are experiencing difficulties from other terrorist attacks, because they know what it's like to be in an explosion. They know what it's like to have flashbacks. They know what it's like to have pain, but they know what it's like to overcome that. These men, as I've said, are pushing the boundaries. And what they're trying to do is to make sure that they are not remembered as the man who lost his legs at work, which is how they phrase it, or the man who had a bad day at the office. They do not want to be defined by their injuries. They want to be defined by what they achieve in their lives. Thank you.